This week we're talking about aperture and depth of field. What is aperture? What is depth of field? What effect does it have on your photograph? Well, aperture comes from the Latin word apertura, which basically means opening. And that's all it is on your lens. The opening of the iris, either letting in a large amount of light or a small amount of light. You dictate that in your camera settings. That is based off of your own eye. Think about when you go outside. You go outside and there's sunshine and your iris narrows because there's way too much light. When it's dark outside, your iris opens to get in as much light as possible. Same thing with your camera. When you open that iris, when you expand or widen the aperture, it's going to let in a lot of light. That's going to bleach out your photograph if you're not careful. If you shut it down, you narrow it, it's going to let in a very small amount of light and it could darken your photograph. But that's not the only effect that aperture has on your photograph. It has the effect of depth of field. And this is where it kind of gets a little confusing. But once you figure this concept out, it will help you make incredible photographs, okay? Aperture is measured in what are called f-stops. Now, if you're just new to photography, just think about them as a series of numbers on a timeline. Low numbers down here, going all the way up to high numbers up here. Now, this is where it kind of gets confusing. The low numbers down here mean a wide aperture, opposite of what you'd think. That means the lens is open as far as it will go. At this end of the spectrum, it's a narrow aperture. That means the lens is as small or as closed as it can get. To add to the confusion, a wide aperture and a wide depth of field are two different things, and a narrow aperture and a narrow depth of field are two different things. A wide aperture makes a narrow depth of field. A narrow aperture makes a wide depth of field. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm going to try and explain that with my video camera here. Okay, I am centered up with my camera and everything is in focus, right? My face is in focus. All of these things back here are in focus. My hand is in focus. But if I were to narrow the depth of field or widen the aperture, only my face is in focus. My hand isn't. All of this stuff back here isn't. Just my face. That is a narrow depth of field. Only this space, this distance right here from the camera is in focus. Now, if I narrow the aperture, I widen the depth of field, now all of this stuff is in focus. Now you may ask yourself, why would I use one or the other? What would be the point of a wide depth of field when the narrow depth of field looks so pretty? Well, in some circumstances, you need everything in focus. Think about a sporting event. A basketball game, perhaps. There's some classic photos of the NBA in the 70s and the 80s, and it looks like everybody's sitting in the dark just watching this game that is bathed in light on the basketball court. You can still see the faces of the people in the audience as they watch the action. One of the reasons you would want a narrow aperture, a wide depth of field, you want to see the reaction of the crowd, you want to see the action in the game, you want all of that in focus. Now, if you're doing a portrait, you want people to focus on a specific point of your photograph, you want a narrow depth of field, a wide aperture, so that people are drawn directly to what you want them to see. That's the difference between wide depth of field, narrow depth of field, and wide aperture and narrow aperture. So for this week's discussion post, I want you to do two things. First of all, I want you to check out the camera simulator link that is included in the discussion post and see what your changes to aperture do to a photograph. You can also see what the changes to shutter speed and ISO will do to the photograph. Pay attention to what it does to the light. When the aperture is wide open, it's a narrow depth of field, it's going to let in a lot of light. That can blow your photograph out, meaning it looks like a white photograph where everything has got too much light on it. On the other end of the spectrum, a narrow aperture or a wide depth of field will make the picture too dark if you're not paying attention to the shutter speed and the ISO. After you're done with that, post 2 pictures of a subject of your choice in a narrow depth of field, wide aperture, narrow depth of field, and submit it in the discussion post.